All right, guys, without further ado, without wasting any time, we are going to call up our next speaker. He's going to be discussing the transformation of the industry of medical instruments. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Bruce Huici.
Hi everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm Bruce Huici. I'm the CEO and founder of Hallstat. It's a medical device company. We focus on reducing hospital-acquired infections. I'm also the self-proclaimed Steve Jobs of Foley catheters. Self-proclaimed because I'm the only one that's proclaiming it, so self-proclaimed. And another reason, I don't really think anyone's going to fight me for the title, so I think I'll be holding on to that for a while. So we wanted to discuss the evolution of some of our most common medical devices. And so today I want to focus on one of our most common medical devices, and that's the urinary catheter. So if anyone's had prolonged surgery here before, they've been in the hospital for a long time, there's a good chance you've had a urinary catheter before. And believe it or not, we've used urinary catheters or some form of urinary drainage system for a really long time. We've been using them since 3000 BC. So back then they would use like rolled up palm leaves, sometimes straw to relieve any kind of urinary drainage pressure. And the first time that we started really evolving and creating something that was more of a real catheter was when Benjamin Franklin, he wanted to design something for his brother. His brother had a lot of urinary drainage problems and bladder pressure, and so he said, all right, let's make something that's a little more malleable and something a little bit more reusable. So he said silver's a good metal because we know it has some antimicrobial properties. So he made a silver catheter. He drilled 2 holes on the top so it could drain the urine, and so the modern day urinary catheter. After that, they started using rubber because the population and patients wanted something a little softer than silver. So they started using rubber, but with time and with our body temperature, they realized that this rubber started deteriorating and started leaving rubber and different debris inside the bladder. They said, okay, so we need a better kind of rubber. We need a higher quality kind of rubber. So who do they go to? They went to Goodyear, right? It's not really your first thought, like, I need to put something in my body. Let me go to a tire company. But actually, Goodyear had a really good technology. They had a higher-end rubber to use that wouldn't deteriorate with our body temperature. And so we continued to progress, and now we started using rubber catheters. And then in the 1930s, Dr. Frederick Foley wanted to create a catheter that was a little bit longer lasting. So we moved to latex catheters, and he added an inflatable balloon at the tip of the catheter. I don't know if you could see it too well there. Maybe we could bring down the lights a little bit. He added an inflatable balloon at the tip of the catheter, and this balloon acted as an anchor at the bottom of the bladder. So you'd insert the catheter, inflate the balloon, it would anchor the catheter, and then you could leave it in there for a prolonged amount of time and drain the urine for a long period of time. Now, of course, even though this was a much better way of draining urine and a longer lasting one, it wasn't very clean, it wasn't very sanitary, and so after that we turned it into a closed system, and you can see we have our Foley catheter there, named after Dr. Foley, and it's attached to a drainage tube, and then that drainage tube pours the urine into a collection bag. So we're still around the 1930s, 1940s, and we come all the way up to today, the 2000, 2010, 2019, and what has evolved since then? Not much. In the past 70 years, we have not done much with our Foley catheter system. But all that started to change around 2008. In 2008, Medicare and Medicaid said, we're starting to get a lot of infections from this system. and no one's really doing anything about it. The hospitals aren't really doing anything about it. So we're going to start putting some pressure on the hospitals. We're going to stop paying for any treatment that's associated with any hospital-acquired infection. So that brings us to these catheter-associated urinary tract infections. Now, 15 to 25% of all inpatients in the US at some point will receive a Foley catheter. 5 to 10% of nursing home patients will receive a catheter. Over 50% of hospitals don't even monitor which patients get a catheter, and over 75% of hospitals don't know how long their patients have a catheter inside of them. So even though we're advancing in technology and we're focusing on technology, in the hospital system, there's still a lot of technological aspects that we're still lacking, and we're not focusing on it. So I mean, those are pretty poor numbers. I mean, 75% of hospitals not able to acquire this data that's so essential. We're doing a pretty poor job, and that leads us to infection rates for this catheter system. Catheter-associated urinary tract infections are actually the most common hospital-acquired infection. They count to up to over 30% of infections in hospitals. They cause about 13,000 deaths a year. I think it's a lot more than that. I mean, just the fact that we can't monitor exactly where these infections are coming from and who has these catheters, it has to be a lot higher. But at least from the data that we can gather, we know that about 13,000 people are dying a year from it. So once a hospital started losing money, they said, okay, this is a big deal now. In 2008, after that, now people started innovating our catheter system again. So they said, okay, we need to start making a catheter system that's going to really reduce infections. And one of the routes of infection is urine backflow. So I'm an ICU nurse, and in nursing school, what they teach us is that if urine flows back into the patient, it carries all the bacteria from the system that's growing inside the system, and it gives them an infection. So what we do to prevent urine backflow is we never have the drainage bag above the level of the bladder. So we're just trying to have gravity work with us instead of working against us. And when you think of that issue, and that's our strategy to solve issues, it's kind of a Neanderthal way of solving that issue. It's, hey, well, just let's hope that gravity works with us and doesn't push that urine back. And so in 2014, one of the largest catheter companies in the world came to our hospital and was talking to all of our nurse managers. And the nurse managers asked, he said, hey, what have you guys done for this urine backflow problem? Do you guys have anything for it? He said, well, we don't really have anything, but if you know anyone who has any good ideas, let us know. We'd be willing to work with them. And so I found out about that. I found out about what happened in the meeting. And I said, actually, I think I have an idea. I think I have a solution for that. So I spent some time. I bought some catheters. And I started cutting up catheters. I made a disaster in my kitchen. I had water all over the place. Of course, I'm not going to use urine. I mean, come on, I'm a little cleaner than that. I'm a nurse. So I use water to simulate urine, and add little rubber catheter pieces all over the place. And eventually I came up with a design for a valve that'll prevent urine backflow. You can see my drawings all the way to the right there. And finally, my high school art class came in handy. So I created the valve. I took it to a patent attorney. We got a patent pending, and I presented it to this company. I said, hey, look, I solved the problem. I created this valve. I know this is a big deal. It's a big deal in our nursing community and in the hospitals. And they're like, well, it's not really too big of a deal. Let's wait until you get your patent issued and then come back and talk to us, and we'll be interested in talking to you then. For anyone who's applied for a patent, you know that it takes around 2 to 4 years to get a patent issued. So I said, well, I'm not going to wait around 2 to 4 years to get a patent to start making a difference. I'm going to start doing this myself. Now, this seems like something really simple. You say, okay, yeah, you want to prevent urine from flowing back, you make a valve, it's no big deal. But what has made this so difficult, and why a lot of these companies weren't able to create this valve, is because you have three main problems. First of all, you have to create a valve that works with very high and low volumes of urine. So some of our patients, they produce very small amounts of urine. So that's not enough volume to push open a valve that requires a lot of pressure. By the same token, you also have to make a valve that works with very high volumes of urine. It also has to be a valve that allows for blood clots and sediment to pass through. So depending on your diagnosis, you might develop blood clots in your bladder, you might have a lot of sediment in your urine, and so if you don't have a valve that's designed to allow these things to pass through, it'll clog immediately, and then it'll create more bladder retention. And then your third problem is it has to be a valve that fits inside of a catheter. I mean, it's a really small catheter, so it has to be a very small valve. And this is the first valve, the Bermel valve. This is the first valve that solves all of those issues. It allows blood clots to pass through and sediment. It opens and works with very high and low volumes of fluid. And of course, it's small enough to fit inside of the distal end of a Foley catheter. So we started manufacturing it, and I said, you know, I think I can make a much better urinary catheter system, just from top to bottom. So we started looking at different issues with our current catheter system, and we started focusing on bladder trauma. As you can see on the right, that's how the catheter looks when it's sitting inside your bladder. You have the balloon that anchors it there at the bottom, and as when the bladder is full, it's full of urine, then it slowly starts draining the urine into the catheter, and then the bladder slowly collapses onto the catheter, like you can see on the left, and that tip of the catheter can puncture or irritate and cause trauma to our bladder lining. So that's why sometimes we see some blood clots in our urine with these catheters, is because it's irritating or causing trauma inside of our bladder. So our bladder lining, just like our skin, we see our skin is our largest organ and really our first line of defense against infection. You know, if you get cut, now you have an open wound and you've opened up the possibility to get an infection. It's the same theory here. If we have damage to the bladder lining, then we're opening the possibility for the bladder to receive bacteria and for bacteria to enter into your bloodstream and become septic. So there's been a couple of different ideas. Most people have focused on trying to change the design of the balloon. But the problem with changing the design of the balloon is that now it's very difficult to manufacture catheters that need a temperature probe or a three-way catheter, which are usually put in kidney transplant patients or any kind of renal patient. So you're very limited to just your two-way Foley catheter. So we needed a design that would reduce bladder trauma, but also allow us to manufacture any kind of catheter that we would need for any kind of surgical procedure. So what we did is, instead of having two drainage holes on the side, we essentially just cut off the tip. We said, you know, instead of draining from the side, we're going to cut off the tip. We're going to make it 1/3 the size of the normal tip, and we're going to drain directly from the top. A pretty simple solution, right? Now also, since this is a closed system, these closed systems create negative pressure. So they create like a vacuum inside of your bladder. So your bladder's not just draining urine through this catheter, it's actually sucking the urine out and pulling the bladder onto the catheter tip. So we also added an enlarged air filter onto our drainage system. This air filter allows for a small amount of air to enter into the system. It gets rid of that negative pressure, that vacuum effect, and allows the bladder to collapse softly onto the catheter tip. So with those two combined, we get rid of bladder trauma. Latex versus silicone. 80% of hospitals in the US are using latex Foley catheters. And they're using them really not because they want to use them, but because the manufacturers in the US, they know that latex is 4 times as cheap as silicone. So they want to save a dime, and they're giving us latex catheters, to save a little bit of money, and us and the patients, we're the ones that are paying the price. Latex is shown through multiple studies to be less biocompatible with human tissue. It causes a lot more tissue irritation inside our urethra. It's also a lot more porous on a microscopic level, so it's a lot easier for it to harbor bacteria. And also, it doesn't adhere as well with the kind of antimicrobial coats that we're adding to these catheters. So again, we have a big problem here that we're not addressing just because we want to save a little bit of money, and our patients are the ones that are paying for it. So in Hallstat, we only use 100% silicone catheters. We don't care that it costs 4 times the price. Our focus is on making the absolute best product. I mentioned a little bit about antimicrobial coats, and that kind of mixes in with what Benjamin Franklin was doing. The majority of the antimicrobial coats that we're putting on these catheters today are silver ion coats. So what we're doing is we're coating these catheters with silver ions, and when you put the catheter in and the urine starts flowing through, it starts eluting or dropping these silver ions into the urine, and they come in contact with bacteria, breaks up the bacterial cell wall, and kills bacteria. The issue with this is that after 7 days, most of that silver has already eluted and it's gone. And we've shown through research that after 7 days, that's when you really start developing bacteria in this catheter system. So when you need the protection the most, that's when it's gone. So he said, we can't just keep doing the same thing that everyone else is doing and follow the same trend of silver ions or medicated coats. So instead, we partnered with someone who had a much more novel technology. We said, instead of trying to kill bacteria, instead of trying to add medication, we're just going to try and repel bacteria. So the idea is to not allow bacteria to adhere to this catheter wall. Because when bacteria adheres to the catheter wall, with time, it grows and multiplies, and then it creates this film called biofilm. Biofilm is what you see on that top picture of the catheter. You see like a crystallized incrustation inside of the catheter. That's biofilm. That's a protective barrier that bacteria creates to protect it from outside elements. So once that biofilm is present, it doesn't matter what you put inside of the catheter. It doesn't matter if you put silver, if you put antibiotics. You're not going to kill that bacteria. It can grow freely and do whatever it wants. So we said, okay, instead of killing bacteria, let's prevent our ability to have biofilm. So we partnered with a company that has an antimicrobial coat that repels bacteria so it doesn't adhere. And what you're seeing in those pictures there, what we did, we put a regular silicone Foley catheter in one patient, and after 2 weeks, the catheter was occluded with biofilm. So we removed it, and in the same patient, we put another silicone Foley catheter with our antimicrobial coat, and 6 weeks later, there was 0 biofilm. So not only is this a much more effective way of reducing bacterial growth, but it's safer and it doesn't cause bacterial resistance like the silver ion strategy. Now going down to our drainage tubing, I mentioned before that bacteria also develops in this drainage tubing, and when it flows back into the bladder, it could introduce that bacteria. We wanted to reduce the amount of bacteria inside of our tubing, even though we had the valve that was going to prevent the urine from coming back. So we infuse our PVC with a bacteriostatic agent that will reduce the ability for bacteria to replicate. It won't kill it, but it'll reduce its ability to replicate. We also use a much softer PVC tubing to reduce kinking and reduce crevices that will also allow for bacteria to grow. So we'll have a less obstructed and smoother tubing for urine to flow out. And then after our drainage tubing, that takes us to our collection system. So our collection system starts with our urometer. This urometer in the ICU, nurses, we use it so we can measure fluid output every 1 to 2 hours. This is huge for us because the amount of fluid that you're putting out is a huge indicator for us as to how your kidney function is, how you're responding to certain medications, if you're becoming septic. Usually when a patient's becoming septic, they start getting, actually they don't get a fever, their temperature starts dropping, but the urine output starts to slow down. So the kidneys take a really big hit. So in a critical situation, your volume of urine output is essential for us to know what's going on inside of your body. In the US, the urometers that we're using are usually 350 mLs. In our system, we're using a 500 ml urometer so we can have more accurate readings. And this makes it more accurate specifically for patients that are taking a lot of Lasix. We're trying to give their kidneys a kickstart, and that Lasix helps them to produce a lot more urine. And sometimes they'll pee 350 to 500 mLs in 1 hour. So with the current systems that we have in the hospital, we get inaccurate readings, and we kind of have to guess at the end of shift exactly how much they put out per hour. After that, we wanted to have a better dating system. So we put the date of insertion right in front of our urometer. This doesn't seem like a big deal, but in the nursing community, it's a huge deal. Right now, all of our catheter systems, every catheter company will tell you, look, our system is good for 28 days, right? The reason why they're saying that it's good for 28 days is not because it's good to have a catheter, or it's okay to have a catheter system for up to 28 days. It's because when they're getting these products approved, the FDA says, okay, if your product is inside of a patient for more than 28 days, it's considered an implantable product. If it's an implantable device, you have to go through a much more expensive and stringent FDA process. So no company is going to want to go through that extensive FDA process for a Foley catheter system. So they say, hey, look, the FDA allows 28 days. It's okay to use it for 28 days. It's not okay to use it for 28 days. Research shows that at 15 days, you have a 99.99%, it's a 100% chance that you're going to have bacteria inside of your system. And so we put the dating system in the front so that nurses and doctors and nurse managers could always know the date that it was inserted, so that they can know that they should remove it as soon as possible. And you can't read it there, but in the bottom, we notify our nurses and doctors that it should be removed after 15 days. So our goal is to always have this date seen and visualized at least 6 times a shift to make sure that it's removed at 15 days instead of 28. Now going down, our collection system is actually a 2-part system. This design is more of a European design. We don't use it here in the States. Why? I don't know. It might be another cost thing. But when it comes to design, Europe is actually more advanced than we are. And so we have a system that breaks up our urometer from our drainage bag. And usually what we're doing in hospitals now is once that drainage bag gets full at the end of shift, there's a little spout in the bottom, which I'll show you. We actually have it as well in case you want to use it, but we're not really pushing anyone to use it because it's very unsanitary. So our systems now, they have this little spout, and we open up that spout and drain all this urine into a urine container that we've been using for the same patient. Then we get that urine and we go to, it's basically a large toilet, a disposable system to dispose all this urine. There's fluid splashing all over the place. Urine could get on the bed, urine could get on your hands. It's a very dirty process. So we wanted to get away from all that, and we created, or we're using a disposable and detachable drainage bag. So instead of draining the urine at the end of shift, you just disconnect the bag, throw it away, and get a new sterile bag. So this will help us to prevent any retrograde infection. So any bacteria that might develop inside the bag won't go to the urometer, it won't go up to the drainage tubing, then into the catheter. Right. So I wanted to kind of spend some time, we're talking about innovation and kind of how these products have been innovated. And instead of spending time talking about the future innovations of some of these common devices and what I think is going to come about in the future and what we could do to make them better, I want to focus more on what it takes to really innovate. What does it take for an ordinary person to do extraordinary things? And so with that, I want to have a little exercise with you guys, and I want you to take a moment and think to yourself, why am I here? Why exactly am I doing what I'm doing today? Now, some of you might ask yourself that question, and when you come to the answer, you might say, actually, I don't really know what I'm doing here. Maybe I don't want to be here. Maybe I want to do something else. I want to do something a little bit more purposeful, and that's fine. And some of you might come to a realization and say, well, this actually means a lot to me, and I'm doing this for this reason. And for those of you, when you find your why, when you find that reason, you'll either go on and do something else that's more significant to you, or you'll start doing what you're doing at a much higher level. But we'll get back to that question later. A few years ago, I I was talking to one of my relatives, and he was, we spoke a lot about it here. He had issues with drug addiction. He had issues with kind of getting his life in order and making anything of himself. And I spoke to him and I said, hey, you know, if you want to get anything done, you have to go to school. You have to go to college and get a degree. You'll never become anybody unless you get a degree. So, you know, let me show you some examples. I'm going to show you some of the most successful people in our history. So of course, I went on my phone, I started Googling, seeing, you know, what universities all these innovators went to. Steve Jobs, he dropped out. Bill Gates, he dropped out too. Henry Ford, no education. And so I started going down, I started searching all these people, and the silence kind of grew awkward. He stayed looking at me like, hey, you gonna give me any names, or? And so I had an epiphany, and I realized innovation, true innovation, isn't made because someone has a college degree. Our schooling is not the deciding factor to if whether we're going to do something great or not. But yet we teach that. We teach that to our kids. We say, hey, look, you need to get straight A's. You have to get a scholarship. You have to go to the best university in the world and get it paid for free. And if not, you're a failure. And so we have kids suffering more depression. We have more stringent testing and schooling to validate their greatness. And we also have higher tuition fees to, again, validate how great and accomplished they are. And by the way, research has shown that straight A students are actually, when it comes to innovation, they're less likely to innovate something or to do something impactful because throughout their life, they become really good at following the rules instead of bending them. And so I said, okay, well, you know, college degree that's not really what pushes someone to do something great. So what is it? Napoleon Hill said it best when he said, it's a definitiveness of purpose, a knowledge of what one wants, and a burning desire to possess it. Okay, I'll repeat that. Definitiveness of purpose, a knowledge of what one wants, and a burning desire to possess it. So what has made some of the greatest human beings in our history great was not their education, but their desire to accomplish something. They wanted it so bad that it didn't matter what the odds were. It didn't matter what people told them. It didn't matter what the experts told them. It didn't matter if they had less money or less experience or knew less people in that industry. They made it happen because they wanted it more than anyone else. By the way, Thomas Edison, when he was a kid, he got kicked out of grade school because his teacher said that he was unteachable and that he was mentally retarded. I think maybe she was wrong. So I have a lot of people that they come to me and they ask me, say, hey, look, Bruce, I have this great idea. I have this great idea, but I have no idea how to do it. How am I going to get this done? And I ask them, well, what do you think of at night? When you're sleeping at night, what are you thinking of? Because see, at night when you're laying in your bed, you're not talking to anyone. You're not dividing your attention to anyone else. Your thoughts are unjudged. You can think of whatever you want. You're free. You're free to dedicate your mind and thought process to anything that you want. If you're not thinking of that thing at night when you sleep, then you don't want it bad enough. Usually what you think of at night, that's usually what you want in life. So, again, I ask, why are you here? What is it that you want? What are you trying to achieve? So in the ICU, being an ICU nurse, I've seen a lot of people pass away, and this kind of helped me to learn my why, my purpose. So if you haven't found out what your why is, what your purpose is, maybe my thought process will kind of help and guide you. So when I ask myself, why am I making these medical devices? I can say, well, I really like it. It's kind of it's my industry. I know about it, and I think I do a pretty good job. I take a lot of joy out of doing it. But if I dig a little deeper, and ask, okay, well, why do I get so much joy out of doing it? Then my answer would be, well, because I really want to help sick people. Then if I dig a little bit deeper and I ask myself, well, why do I want to help sick people? I mean, there's a lot of people that can help sick people. And then I look back at my experience in the ICU, and I see all the people that have passed away, and I say, I want to help sick people because I know that at some point in my life, I will also pass away. And when I pass away, I won't be able to help my children anymore. In their time of weakness, I won't be able to be there for them. And eventually, my children will get to a point where they'll be in a hospital bed, and they'll be sick and weak. And the only way that I can still take care of them is if I spend the rest of my life making medical devices that will increase their quality of care, even if I'm not there. So why am I doing what I do? I do it because it's the only way that I can care for my children, even after I pass from this life. And that's my why. And so when you find your why, when you find your purpose, it'll push you to a point that you'll do whatever it takes to accomplish what you want to accomplish. When you find your why, you'll have a definitiveness of purpose, you'll know what you want, and you'll have a burning desire to possess it. At Hallstat, we have found a lot of success because we understand these things, and we strive to live with purpose. Thank you.
Do we have any questions for Bruce? We got enough time for a couple of questions, so if you do have a question, just raise your hand. We'll bring the mic over to you.
All right, I guess
All
we
right,
got the
thank
point
you.
across then.
Let's give him a hand,
Thank
please.
you.
Thank you.